All right.
Thank you. Well, I'm gonna try and be very brief because, to be perfectly honest with you, the first evening was a sort of illuminating experience for me to hear you talk about what constituencies mean to you, from your perspective as an intellectual in Spain involved in these things. Because I realized that there was some kind of mistranslation of maybe not just between the languages but also of what you might do with the term. I had, and I articulated that a little bit yesterday when I said, when we talked about the book and all these things, let's try and avoid a scenario where we make something, where we try to make something enforceable without having thought through what it might mean. And I think that for me it was very, very both interesting and useful to hear you, because I think that what I will bring with me from this conference is more a much higher level of confidence in this idea of constituencies, that it can actually be a good thing for us. And that's not a small thing, because I think most of our colleagues back home were really struggling with this because we thought it was just something being an imposition of a need to use a new word for something that we already do, which is almost a bit demoralizing. It's almost like you have to come up with, in the cycles of funding and political correctness, you always have to come up with new excuses to continue doing what you actually believe in. Because you do believe in what you do, you just have to come up with new ways of justifying them all the time. And that is that, and I don't really have that feeling now, to be honest with you. So I'm going to basically scrap what I wrote here, but not quite, because what I tried to do in the museum was just to make it more interesting, because it was sort of dreadfully uninteresting, the whole thing with constituencies, to most of us in our museum. And I tried to make it more interesting by saying, let's look back at history at other terms that have actually radically changed their meaning. And of course, the obvious candidate for that discussion is revolution. Revolution in the 18th century, before the French Revolution, meant basically what we today would describe by the term evolution. It was something slow, revolution, it's something turning around itself slowly and predictably. That was revolution, and it's from Hannah Arendt, it's like common knowledge. And then once you had the revolutionary situation, and the tipping point, and the step function, step change, or whatever term you want to use, it changed, the meaning changed. Not from one day to another, but within the space of this very difficult process. If you read, I can recommend you actually a book that's kind of funny. It's Mémoires d'Outre-Temps by Chateaubriand. It's like a 2,000-page book or something, but it's his very, very redacted memories of things that he saw and heard and lived through in those years of the French Revolution, and it's kind of an eyewitness account of this. But so if we read that, we understand how confused it was, and how many different opinions there were, and how many different people are now being forgotten. Exactly what was talked about before, I think by Alexei, who talked about the confusion of the Russian Revolution, of the Bolshevik Revolution, and of course also of the Russian Revolution before the Bolsheviks. So that confusion is sometimes lost to us. Revolution changed its meaning. And when that happened, I was just trying, in order to inspire myself and my colleagues a bit, to go back in history and think super simple, that before the revolution in France, basically the only important term was the subject, the individual or the groups in society that was subject or subjected to political power. And then somehow that changed with the revolution into the citizen. And then somehow, of course, when the revolution evolved into something else, in a certain sense you went back to subject, in the 19th century with the reaction. But you also went to shareholding. Like the only people who could vote in Belgium, for instance, just to take an example that's close to us at Nuka, Belgium was also a product of the French Revolution, belatedly in 1830. It's still a very compromised place because of that. The only people who could vote in Belgium in the 19th century were people who earned a certain amount of money or who owned a certain amount of property. They could vote. So they were the corporation, they were the shareholders, they could vote. And then of course, this vision of society with these roles collapsed after the First World War, and there was, in some countries, a move back to the citizen. And different systems differently interpret. And then to simplify everything again, you know, like after the Second World War, there was a certain, you know, again in some countries, you know, a drift from seeing members of society as citizens with rights and obligations to basically trying to influence them as clients. And then in the 80s, there was, at least in Scandinavia, a concerted effort to replace the idea of the client with the idea of the user. And that maybe talks more about the specific late social democratic system in Norway and Sweden in the 80s, where there was state-sponsored democracy reviews. That they allowed them to take quite a long time. I think the Norwegian one was the first one, maybe 5-6 years, and then the Swedish one took even longer. And basically what they ended up was the concept of the user. But of course that's also flawed. So what we thought when we thought about constituencies was that it was a way of inflating some kind of new life into the idea of the user, which itself is very difficult to separate from the client. And whether we could re-politicize this in some way by calling it constituencies, and whether that might be the way to make it more interesting and relevant. Now, when listening to you, I understand that it's a little bit of a linguistic confusion, but it's also like us having forgotten the more radical aspects of this nexus of words, which is constituent, constituency, and constitution. You know, and with us using bastardized versions of Latin, for instance, in English, we sort of sometimes get lost in these words. But it's important to think about, you know, what is process, what is result, what is prejudice, what is true experience when we use these terms. And I think you helped me, at least, to get closer to the process of it and to the radical opening up of something unpredictable. And John was also talking about, you know, the value of using contested terms, the value of using terms where we don't agree and where we actually don't. And that, by the way, was also something I appreciated in your talk, that you were stressing so many times that we don't know. We don't know what's happening with revolutions. We don't know why. We don't know how we can prevent it. So if we can bring ourselves back to this more organic, perhaps, way of looking at it, more radical and more based on thinking. That's also why I yesterday made a plea for putting together a more theoretical book, because I think a more theoretical book is also a more polemical book, and a more interesting book perhaps, and paradoxically maybe also a more useful book in the end than a handbook would be, you know, than a book of case studies from our museums would be. But it's not up to me, and maybe not even up to this meeting, to really say something about it, but since we talked about it yesterday, I think it's interesting to know. Now, what I tried to do here, again in order to make this whole thing a bit more interesting, was to say, don't forget the artists. We are still, and that's the paradox that we always end up facing when we take an interest in political processes as museums, that at the end of the day we are still obliged to, and want to also, work with the visual, work with the products of the processes that people outside of the institutions are engaging in this case mostly artists, not only but mostly. And we shouldn't forget that, and we shouldn't apologize for it, and we shouldn't stray too far away from our core mission, because then again we become more precarious. So it's all part of a chain of arguments and ideas. So in that sense, I thought it could be interesting to propose the term the eternal network, la fête permanente, which comes from the French economist, poet, and artist Robert Filiou, and not accidentally, I am working on a retrospective of Filiou. But that's why I know the term. So the thing is that he coined a lot of interesting and also useful phrases. The title of the exhibition is The Secret of Permanent Creation, which is also a quote from Filiou. I'm not going to talk you through all this, but you can read some of the quotes here. Maybe before I move on, just very briefly about Filiou. He was born in 1926. So he was a teenager during the Vichy regime, and he was from the south of France, from a Protestant family, which is also important. So during Vichy, he was actually an active member of the resistance of La Résistance. Now, many people say they were, but he actually was. And when he was 16, 17, he was a very young man. He grew fast, he was very tall, you know. So he was interrogated by the Gestapo, all these things, and so he really had his period of political struggle. But after the end of the war, when he was 19, he went to the US to look for his father, who was a wandering tailor. So he had strayed away from the family, and he thought he could find him in the US, and he actually did. So that's why he went to the US, but in the meantime he started working for the Coca-Cola Corporation as a worker in their plant in Los Angeles, and he studied political economy in the US after the war. So he was a professional American educated economist. He became an American citizen, and he started working for the United Nations. So he was a co-author of the economic reconstruction plan for South Korea after the Korean War in early to mid 50s. Well, I think this was 54. But then he decided to quit. You know, he quit the United Nations, quit his career as an economist, became a poet, a playwright. He never had any money. He always led a very precarious existence. He was in Spain, he was in Denmark, he met his wife in Denmark, he moved to France. He never quite managed to establish himself in Paris because he never had any money. So that's the sort of socio-economic background of who he was. But he was also influenced through his stay in Korea by Buddhism, and particularly by Zen Buddhism, which you can see, I think, in this quote that's up now. And I'm telling you all this because everything that every artist does is dated. And this doesn't mean in a derogatory way to say that it's no longer interesting or no longer applicable. Just to say that it has a specific date attached to it. In the case of Filiou, it is first the 50s and 60s, the early 60s, when this today quite dated concept of homo ludens, the playing man, had hard currency. It was something you needed that in order to confront not just the stiffness of the older generation, but also the danger of fascism that was not even hiding, but was in plain sight in the mores and morals of the older generation. So the concept of playing man today doesn't seem radical at all, but at the time I think it was necessary and useful. And then of course they moved on from that after 68 and during 68 to other ideas, of course, and I don't have to go into all that now, and Filiou also did. So Filiou's thinking radicalized in time. But there is still an element in this term, the eternal network, la fête permanente, which comes from his collaboration with George Brecht, the American composer and poet and artist. They ran a little non-shop in the French Riviera, Villefranche-sur-Mer, that was called La Cédille qui sourit. La Cédille is this little thing you have under the sea in French. So it was a kind of a nonsensical thing, and they never even sold anything. And when they dissolved that, they said, we're going to continue because we have our eternal network of collaborators all over the world, in the US, in Asia, all over Europe. And that's our eternal network. That is our, if you like, our constituency, in the more traditional use of the term. That's why I thought I could use this here. And then he immediately, because he was bilingual, and not many people in France are bilingual even now in English and French, he chose to translate it into French as la fête permanente, which again, relates to 1968, but also to Homo Ludens. So just to situate it a little bit. And it is in turn connected to what I have identified as the core idea authored by Fouillou for our exhibition, which is permanent creation. And permanent creation was actually started as something very simple. It was his Danish-born wife who said, "You are artists while you create your work, but what are you when you are not creating your work? Couldn't you find a way of always being artists regardless of whether you're producing or not?" And then they thought, you have a point there. So the idea of permanent creation came out of that. It's hard to illustrate the eternal network, la fête permanente, so I'm not going to try to do it. I'm just going to briefly, if you don't know his work, this is just a teaser. This is the first thing he ever did as an artist. It's actually a play, L'immortel mort du monde, 1960. This was when he took the step from being somebody who wrote and spoke to somebody who also produced visuals. But it is actually just a sort of a setup for a play where you can shift all these lines, and it's like a board game. Again, Homo Ludens. And then in the 60s, early 70s, he also produced a rather extensive series of works called joint works. But they were not just joint works with other artists, but also, as you can see here, with the rain and the sun outside. And then there's the principle of equivalence. This is one work that illustrates that. And you see here, I took this opportunity to develop visually what I consider an important element of permanent creation, the principle of equivalence. Well made, badly made, not made. He said there's no difference between them. So he's kind of getting rid of the whole idea of quality and judgment, which is radical, but it's framed as play, as always with Fouillou. What's most radical is also what's most playful. Can't go into details, but this one is really nice. This is the Commission Mixte d'Échange de Monuments aux Morts, 1970. A suggestion with the intention to achieve the reconciliation of nations by one effective action only. To give an example which other continents might follow one day, to honor the victims of the 20th century world wars in a truthful way, to make future generations aware of the absurd and murderous obscenity of all nationalisms, something we talked about here, to carry out the final fraternization of the towns and villages of Europe, to change the pompous and revengeful style of history writing into a new generous expression of our destiny. We hereby solemnly suggest to the nations of Europe a mutual exchange of their war memorials. So you move the Belgian memorials to Germany, you move, the German memorials to France, because they all look the same. It's just that they have different enemies. Very simple, very clever. Obviously, never realized. Yeah, and then he was also very much interested in the concept of research. The most interesting artistic research, and I think he actually coined this idea of artistic research. Going on now is research into new ways of living. However, the most important art form lies now outside the field of regular art information. I think museums should subsidize it and make it known, etc., etc. He organized an exhibition in 1971 called Research at Stedelijk, where he stayed for a month at Stedelijk talking to the visitors. And that was the research. Stephen probably knows more about it. And at the same time, in parallel, there was an exhibition in Antwerp in the gallery that was very active then, called Wide White Space. I cannot go into this because I want to stick to my allotted time. Just want to show you the last work that he made. Because he, at the end of his life, took this idea of Buddhism and Zen much more seriously than before. And together with Marianne, his wife, they retreated into a Lamaist monastery in the south of France, in the Dordogne, for 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days. Now, unfortunately, he couldn't spend all of this time in reclusion there because he was seriously ill with cancer and he had to move home. towards the end of his stay in the monastery, of his planned stay, and he passed away in 1987. But this is one of his last works. It's called Time in a Nutshell, because they were not really allowed to talk to each other in the monastery. You know, it was like a silent retreat. So what he would do, he would write little sentences on small pieces of paper, and he would crumple them up, fold them up, and put them into walnut shells, and then close them again with an elastic band. So Time in a Nutshell is basically, literally, his last writings in nutshells. I just find it quite nice as an art. Now, the idea of introducing filiu to you here is basically to say, in order to reconnect to what's interesting, and could be interesting in the term constituencies, don't forget the thinking and practice of artists, and in this case, filiu, and maybe he can guide us a little bit into the territory that you also opened up for us the first evening. Thank you. And I will rewrite this, actually, now. So this, for once, I will actually do it. The way this whole thing is set up.
Okay. So, Pancho.
Yes. One question can I ask?
Sure.
He died in 80s, right?
87.
Yeah. And what about this living artist and dead artist working with? You said it's important to remember the artist, but what's the difference then living artist and dead artist?
Oh, there is, and in this case, I mean, the difference is not as great as you might think, because of course the ideas that filiu put out in the world are still very much there, and they're also still very much referred to by younger artists and by people who are still alive, and by the people who were his friends.
But it's kind of still interpretation of his ideas, not a conversation with him.
The only way to have a conversation with him is to look at the work again, look at his writing again, and talk to the people who knew him.
What Zdenka said earlier about representation and what was it?
Partnership.
Partnership.
Well, I mean, as a
in
museum,
terms of that.
no, but as a museum, we are doing different things. Huh? So we are engaging with artists who are alive in various ways. I do it all the time. We are doing things, the equivalent of the Dali exhibition, you know, to bring in people and to get good reviews in the local press. And we are engaging with artists who we believe are a kind of inspiration to others. Jimmy Durham is one of them. We did organized a big retrospective of Jimmy Durham. Now Jimmy's still alive, so we did it in conversation with him. But there is no, for me at least, no very strict line of demarcation between an artist like Jimmy, who is still alive, and an artist like filiu, who is not, or let's say an artist like James Lee Byers, who also has relevance to the situation in Antwerp. You can still engage with the ideas left by the artist in the work. And even, you know, I would even say there's not necessarily a very strong qualitative difference in the engagement. It's different because you can't talk to the person. He's not there anymore, or she. But you can still engage. And that's, I think, for me, very important. A very important factor is to talk to the people who knew him, like with his wife, for instance, and with other people who worked with her, with his editors, who edited his books. And Irmelin Osman Lebeer, who had a publishing house in Brussels, and who was filiu's editor, is now going to help me to edit the catalog, for instance. Because she also sits on material that's quite unique, you know, like cassette tapes that she has interviewing in the 70s. So we do what we can to go back to the source, you know? But of course it's different.
Here the question of heritage, I think, is irrelevant, you know, because you can look at the heritage of that artist's ideas from different perspectives. I think in our frame of subject that we are dealing here with, the idea of active heritage would be maybe appropriate. You know, how you really create conversation, but not the conversation, you know, the
Unfortunately,
in terms
we
of
can't.
interpretation, but more in terms of use, you know.
And there's something that maybe I should also have said, which is that he coined many different terms and ideas. I mentioned a couple, but there is another one that's very interesting, and that is teaching and learning as performance art. There's a book with this title from 1970, which has been re-edited, and he did a lot of teaching as well. And people whom he taught have continued to teach according to his principles. Like, for instance, there's a very interesting artist in Iceland, Magnus Paulsson, who is old, he's 85, 86, but still going strong, who invited Filiu to come to Iceland in the 70s to teach according to these principles, and who took over the principles and, you know, continued them in Iceland. So there's the generation of Icelandic artists who studied in the late 70s, who are also in a certain sense, you know, continue Filiu's ideas, you know, in unexpected places like that.
And that comes no surprise.
No, because
what did you say?
It comes as no surprise. If
no,
it's
Yeah.
of course, because the ideas are still. I mean, I say they're dated.
But
Just-
my question was about something else, but we can discuss later. I mean,
Yeah,
it's same for
yeah.
Alan Capro and a lot of artists at the end of the day. But I'm interested with the precarity when they were still alive, in their own personal life,
Yeah.
and when they all work is about life
Yeah.
itself,
Yeah.
and when institutions actually collaborate with them afterwards. Because you can actually, in a performative way, do a collaboration with artists like that, even if they're not around, because they vision their practice that way.
Sure. And that's also why, you know, it's not enough just to collect artifacts by them.
Absolutely.
It's not the way we're trying to do this also.
Yeah, but they already think about it when they're alive. This kind of art.
Yeah, they do. I mean, in the case of Filiu, it's also important to consider the videos, because the videos are also part of his educational practice.
It just said he didn't see the show. He did.
Okay.
Okay, gotcha.